Okay, good morning. Welcome to PoliTALK, brought to you by the Greater Wausau Chamber of Commerce. My name is Michael Loy, and I'm the current chairperson of the Chamber Board of Directors and the CEO at North Central Healthcare here in Wausau. Today, we're going to hear from Senator Tammy Baldwin, who represents the state of Wisconsin in the U.S. Senate. Senator Baldwin will offer an update from Washington, D.C., and will discuss topics relevant to the businesses and constituents in Wisconsin. This session is designed to be interactive, and we encourage questions from the audience. You may type your questions in the chat box on the left side of your screen. We will try to get to as many questions as possible in the time we have allotted. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Chamber's YouTube and social media pages following this event. Senator Baldwin, before I get to you, I have two topics I want to start with today. First is, I'm sure you're well aware, but the Wisconsin women's hockey team are now national champions, and I know you're a Madison native and a Wisconsin alumni. How excited were you to see their victory on Saturday?
Oh my goodness, I am thrilled. Back-to-back victories, although there was a hiatus last year because of the pandemic, and I think 6-time national champions now. Pretty exciting.
Yeah, they were a great team. They were really dominant throughout the whole game. It was fun to watch.
Yes.
And then the second is, as you know, in March, we're celebrating Women's History Month, and you are certainly somebody to be celebrated in Wisconsin's history. You were the first female member of Congress for the state of Wisconsin and the first female senator for the state of Wisconsin as well. So congratulations on that and all your accomplishments, and hopefully the first of many more to come.
Thank you. And as many say, the first but not the last. We make progress when people follow through those shattered ceilings, if you will. So, no, I very much appreciate that.
As a father of 3 young daughters, I certainly root for that.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to turn it over to you to go ahead and start with your update.
Wonderful. Well, I thought I'd start with the recently passed American Rescue Package before turning ahead to issues that I think will be coming before the United States Congress in the weeks and months to come. So the American Rescue Plan is, I think, about a 10-day-old law now. And it is something that our new president, Joe Biden, promised during his campaign and his transition as a very comprehensive plan to bring us from where we are right now, which is still in the midst of a pandemic, to where we hope to be in just a matter of months, which is beginning to see that pandemic in the rearview mirror. Many of the investments in this bill do relate to our public health, do relate to scaling up our vaccination efforts. And in fact, some really good news has been shared with regard to opening up eligibility to vaccination, not just to what was considered phase 1A and phase 1B, but to all adults. And at first, our challenges were demand being far in excess of supply. But in the coming weeks, we think we're going to have a supply that keeps up with demand. And frankly, in the out months, it may be more focused on persuading vaccination skeptics or hesitant people that they really need to protect their own health and those loved ones by getting vaccinated. But all of those will begin our path to more normalcy. And beyond the vaccination efforts, there's one other or a couple of other pandemic-related things I want to note in that measure. One that I pushed very hard was our surveillance of coronavirus variants or mutations. My sense is one of the biggest challenges to getting this pandemic in the rearview mirror would be the emergence of a mutation or a variant that eludes the vaccines that we have, or that eludes the therapeutics and treatments that we've advanced to make the pandemic less deadly. And we in the United States are far behind many of our near peers in terms of surveilling those variants. Only a tiny, tiny sample of positive coronavirus tests are sent to labs to be genomically sequenced. And so if we're going blind, we have that potential to set us back. And I don't want to see anything set us back, given how far we've come. A lot of the American Rescue Plan also focuses on the health and survivability of small businesses, of our agricultural businesses. There's a renewal of the Paycheck Protection Program administered by the SBA, including the option of people taking second loans that are ultimately forgivable. Since those programs were stood up over a year ago in the CARES Act, there have been many modifications. And I want to just give a shout out to people on this call right now, because a lot of those modifications were brought to my attention by folks on the front lines experiencing the complexities of applying for forgiveness, or finding the eligibility rules just didn't suit them. I'm going to give you one agricultural example of that, and that is that small family farms in Wisconsin found in many cases they weren't eligible. A farm couple a little north of Marathon County contacted me saying, we applied for the PPP program and got an $80 loan, 80. Why? Well, the loan size is based on either payroll or net profits from the prior year. In dairy farming, it is not at all surprising that some don't have any payroll, because it's the family members who work the farm. And we've seen such harsh times in dairy that net profits was not a good measure. I joined with my Republican colleague, Senator John Thune from South Dakota, to create a new eligibility formula to allow farmers to use gross revenues from the prior year. And that is being implemented now. And finally, there's some relief for a group of small businesses that were left out of earlier rounds. So anyways, again, a shout out to all of you for providing us with real-time feedback on how these programs were working. I'm going to try to police myself for time, but I get so excited about this stuff. I talk a lot. I want to say that in this latest version, there's special attention to restaurants and small live performance venues and others in the hospitality industry. Many of those industries and businesses were the first to have to close or operate at far reduced capacity, and many will be the very last to reopen fully. And so restaurants have gathered together to propose very specific provisions, some of which were incorporated in this latest round. There's also aid to state and local governments. That was something that we were unable to get done in the last session. And yet I hear from local leaders all the time about reduced revenues because of the reduction in hospitality, for example, and laying off frontline workers at a time when we've also put on the shoulders of local government all the extra responsibilities of fighting this pandemic through their public health departments and many other areas. So that will be forthcoming. Let me just take a few minutes to talk about looking ahead. President Biden talked about having a very comprehensive coronavirus rescue plan, followed by something that I expect he will ultimately name the Build Back Better Act. Just guessing from his use of that rhetoric, but something that acknowledges that our economy has taken a huge hit nationally and locally during the pandemic year, and that we don't want to make the mistake of our last major recession, where our recovery took a sluggish 7 years to get back to where we were prior. And so while we do not have details yet on individual provisions of this economic recovery or Build Back Better plan, we do expect a very significant focus to be on manufacturing, infrastructure, and jobs, including robust job training for those who may need, maybe have been out of the workforce for a long time, need some additional assistance in retooling and getting back to work. Infrastructure, I think you'll see, is defined very broadly, not only to include roads and bridges, but also to include broadband, drinking water, wastewater, and other water infrastructure related issues. And we're very much excited about getting to work on that probably after our spring recess ends over the next couple of weeks. Also, we do expect to have a bill that deals with R&D and supply chain challenges that may come up before Build Back Better. I just want to say that one thing the pandemic has shown us is, especially in the early days when you have a global crisis and we don't manufacture everything we need to confront that global crisis here in America, that supply chains became an enormous issue. The shortages with personal protective equipment, including N95 masks, with testing, including swabs and reagents, with medical equipment. And I think a lot have looked within and said, we ought to have some capacity to produce that here. And that we never want to be in a place in the United States where we can't defend not only the national security, but the health and safety of our citizens. So there's opportunities for Wisconsin in this, and I am excited about engaging in that conversation. Lastly, I just want to tell you a few changes for me. Well, we know there was a change in the majority in the United States Senate by a 50-50 margin, with the vice president able to break ties. Democrats have taken the majority. And that means instead of being the ranking Democrat on several committees, I now wield 2 gavels. And I wanted to just share that for your interest and awareness. I sit on 3 major committees: the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, which we call by the acronym the HELP Committee. I sit on the Appropriations Committee, and I sit on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. The 2 gavels I have, one is a subcommittee in Appropriations dealing with agriculture, rural development, and the Food and Drug Administration. That is actually the gavel that my predecessor, Herb Cole, held for many years, and he did incredible work there, and I'm very interested in carrying on that tradition and fighting for Wisconsin in that adventure. The other gavel that I now wield, if you will, is on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. It's a subcommittee on what's actually a nice array of issues. It deals with coastal issues, and by the way, the Great Lakes are considered coasts, so it's not irrelevant to our state as a whole. But coastal, climate change, and manufacturing policy. What a combination! But I know it is a post from which very important conversations are going to occur. And again, I'm looking forward to having input from all of you, not only today through Q&A and conversation, but also in the session to come. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. We're really happy that you're here. And thank you for that quick update. There's a lot in there. There'll be some follow-up questions that I have. There are questions that are starting to pour in, which is great. The one thing I wanted to start with is that it looks like on the president's calendar today, he is slated to meet with the Senate Democratic Caucus as part of your annual retreat. You covered some major policy issues that you've gotten through or are looking at. And people often say that in the first term of any presidency, there's like one major legislative push that they can get through. You could argue that this last COVID-related package could be it, but I think there's probably another one in the docket here. You've covered a couple. Which one do you really think is going to be the priority, and which one do you think he'll really be able to get done in this term?
Well, I do think that because it is part of his overarching agenda, that this Build Back Better Act, I'm jumping the gun on naming it, but I just have this feeling that that's what he's going to call it, dealing with our infrastructure deficits and dealing with recharging our economy so that we don't have a sluggish recovery from this crisis, but rather very robust recovery from this crisis. That will be a second major accomplishment. I don't want to spend, well, I'll spend as much time as you want on the intricacies of Senate procedure. But the reason I think he will be able to get that over the finish line with our help is that I believe he will use or propose the use of the budget reconciliation process for dealing with that legislation. The only thing I would caution about that is that this budget reconciliation is sort of a carve out from our usual process, which requires typically 60 votes to pass substantive legislation. But that carve out requires that the provisions of any bill used through that procedure be very focused on budgetary related matters, which means that some provisions will probably be kicked out because they're policy related and not budget related. That said, it still has the prospect of being an extremely important piece of legislation to not only rebuild to the way things were beforehand, but as the name implies, build back better.
Yeah, it's an interesting moniker for the program, and clearly anything to get the economy going and infrastructure related is something that we look forward to seeing. There's a lot of aging infrastructure that needs to be addressed that can help the free market thrive around that. So that's exciting for us. One of the questions that came through is a really important one, and you see it in the headlines today, and it's not something you touched on, but it's an important one to the nation that I'm not so sure we've gotten our hands around effectively, and that's the issue of immigration. There's a lot happening on our southern border right now, and just this morning, I was personally trying to work through immigration to get a highly trained physician to be able to work in our country. My own personal experience in that is I better hire an attorney just to get through the system. I can't imagine what the people at the border have to deal with to try to figure that out. What do you think we can get done on immigration and really try to solve that problem once and for all, or at least for this generation?
Yeah. Well, the premise of that question is something I agree with. We have a broken system, and it's been broken for a long time. And numerous previous endeavors to update it, to fix it, have failed in one house or the other. In fact, the last major immigration reform measure that went through on a bipartisan basis, one house, was in my first term in the United States Senate, when a comprehensive immigration reform bill got 68 votes in the United States Senate, went over to the House, and they never took it out. And that was most fortunate because they only require a simple majority vote to pass substantive legislation there. But there was a decision made not to advance it for consideration. I will also mention anecdotally, Michael, sort of dovetailing on what you said, you're trying to get a highly skilled employee to either, be able to remain or to come in. People call my office all the time on such matters, and I will tell you that just this morning, we have a Monday morning all staff call where different folks report out on the challenges that they have been assisting constituents with. And yes, we had quite a report on some of the challenges that we face here in Wisconsin, including somebody who'd been caring for our elderly for 10 years, who was facing a deportation, and being able to at least have that set off for a short time, as this individual also has 4 children and is a single mom and works full time, again, assisting our elderly. So we have all sorts of arrays of challenges. And I would be, the first to say that the challenges being experienced on the southern border right now are very, very significant. So how is, and we may end up talking to the president about this tonight when we have our meeting with him. But I will say that right now, the House and Senate appear to be taking very different approaches. Not that I would say one is bad or one is good. The House has already advanced several pieces of immigration-related legislation that sort of break down the larger issue, so that they've passed legislation dealing with dreamers or deferred dreamers. Let's just say they've advanced legislation looking at the parents of dreamers. They've advanced legislation and are discussing legislation dealing with farm workers, something that is a big issue for Wisconsin. And I might add, in previous iterations, one of the things that the farm worker provisions have often neglected is a recognition that in America's dairyland, seasonal visas are not adequate to the task, because dairy cows need to be milked every day, 365 days a year. And this measure that they've advanced actually recognizes that finally, that the dairy industry has different needs than do those who are farming crops, et cetera. So they're taking this issue by issue approach. And the Senate, we have a measure which is very much reflective of what President Biden has said he would like to see advanced. So it's much more comprehensive. And now that hasn't advanced through the Senate yet, but I think we have a juncture right now that in the next few weeks, I hope we'll get some clarity of whether we're going to take that step-by-step approach, or whether we're going to try to do a larger response. But it is an issue getting a lot of attention right now. And I think, especially in a state like Wisconsin, which is many miles removed from the southern border, the issues that I hear most urgently relate to agriculture workers, having highly skilled workers who are part of the Wisconsin economy be able to remain, and some family reunification issues.
Thank you for that. And thank you. A couple of years ago, your office helped me get one of our physicians out of Peru that was unfortunately stuck there through an immigration issue. So I know you're very well versed in that topic. So the next question that we have that came in really is related to the overall debt. Obviously, with the last two packages that put through, I mean, it got our economy through, it got our citizens through the pandemic, hopefully through it. Hopefully we're on the tail end of everything. And then, looking forward, obviously some of that has worked. It's worked in a lot of ways. And the Fed just reforecasted their growth projections for this year, I think 6% or something along that line, which is very attractive. But at some point, the debt that's been put out there is going to have to be addressed, and certainly in future generations. Can you just talk about, how you balance that and what that forecast looks like, and how we can start to maybe address that issue as well?
Yes. So Debt and deficit are very significant issues. And I always think it's really important to have a clear-eyed sense of how we got to where we are right now, because it is a cumulative impact of decisions made over a significant period of time. And I don't want us to necessarily point to our pandemic response and divorce it from the tax legislation that was passed in late 2017 and the basically deferred obligation to pay for two major wars that have lasted decades. And so that sort of understanding, I think, is really important, because if we don't acknowledge the, I don't want to call them building blocks of debt, we are likely to end up with a response that sort of looks at the last thing we did. I think the last thing we did is probably, of all of those building blocks that I talked about, the most likely to lead to greater revenues and greater growth. And, we're already seeing, for example, direct stimulus payments being used in ways that are really helping elevate our local economies, helping small businesses survive and make it through this gruesome last year. And I think that I'd make the argument that passing a $2 trillion tax measure that was supposed to trickle down, but I don't think did, and that was supposed to pay for itself, but I don't think did, is something we have to balance there. So I hope that in confronting debt and deficit, that we take a serious look at how we got there, and then take appropriate policy steps to make sure we don't make previous mistakes again. Then the other thing I would say as we move to the next steps of building back better is that we don't that we don't make things worse at that point. We have to start confronting how we're going to pay for deferred maintenance on our nation's infrastructure. I will add that most businesses would look at deferred maintenance and deferred upgrades as a deficit on the business in much the same way they would look at taking out loans, et cetera. And that if we fail to address our crumbling infrastructure and our lack of universal access to broadband, et cetera, we are ignoring a true economic deficit that exists. We don't usually quantify that. It can be quantified, but it's something really important. And I think probably the best test of how we're going to move forward is how, hopefully on a bipartisan basis, we tackle the issue that our historic funding sources for infrastructure no longer allow us to keep up with the need. It used to be a gas tax was sufficient to cover our surface transportation needs. That went out of balance many years back now, and we have failed to rise to the occasion of identify a sustainable way to maintain our infrastructure without deficit spending. And we've also seen at that same time the issue of our surface transportation bills go from being the most wildly bipartisan initiatives that come through Congress to being one of the more contentious issues. This was never, when I was first in the House of Representatives, those bills would pass, with 95% support, both parties, and they don't anymore. So I think this will be the first test of whether we can come together to address uh, uh, deficit issues of deficit and debt, using infrastructure as maybe the canary in the coal mine for larger bipartisan cooperation moving forward.
So the next couple of questions get to kind of the overall emotional state, I would call it, of the United States right now. The first question is just kind of interested in your own perspective on the events that happened in the Capitol in January, your own personal experience with that, and what you see as a response to that attack in this term.
Yes. Well, in terms of my own personal experience, we were in the process of counting the electoral ballots, the roll call of the states in alphabetical order. And that was done. Typically, that's a formality that raises very little attention, but that was not the case in this past election, in part because of baseless allegations of widespread voter fraud that might have changed the outcome of the election. I think that those of us in Wisconsin who got a chance to see up close the care with which our local elected officials held a fair and transparent election, which withstood both canvasses afterwards confirming the result, and then recounts in our two most populous counties confirming the results. And knowing that our local election officials are nonpartisan officials who do this year in and year out, I had great confidence, but these conspiracy theories were being fueled. And there was, sadly, therefore, a spectrum of the American population who were believing them. And so as we were doing our duty to count the electoral ballots, we witnessed an endeavor to literally physically interfere with that process. The joint session had recessed so that each house of Congress could hear arguments on the electoral results in Arizona. So it was very beginning of the alphabet, very early in our process. And I was in the Senate chamber. Before I entered, I looked out the window, looking down the mall, and saw thousands of people approaching the Capitol. And then, our debate proceeded. I'm just giving you the color commentary as I recall it and saw it. And Vice President Pence was presiding over the Senate as he would as the tiebreaker and the president of the Senate. He was whisked off suddenly. The most senior Republican president pro tem of the Senate, Chuck Grassley, was put in the chair. He was immediately whisked off, and we recessed, and they turned off the cameras. The doors of the chamber, the many doors of the chamber, were all shut and locked. And we were given information that they believed at the time the safest place for us to be would be to remain in the Senate chambers. Ultimately, as we saw, both later that day on live television, but also during the impeachment trial with footage we hadn't seen before, there was a decision made that we weren't going to be safe in the chamber. That the chamber was likely to be breached, and thank God all members and staff were brought off the floor and into one of the neighboring buildings. So that's kind of the, and then I was getting real-time communications from people across the country to like, are you safe? What's going on? It was a violent insurrection. And as we know, it resulted in the fortification of the Capitol. It resulted in an impeachment trial. It resulted in deaths of police officers and 140 injured police officers. And I talk to our Capitol Police every day. And I would say some invisible lasting injuries. I'm glad that the pace of arrest and prosecution and investigation is picking up. I'm grateful for citizens who have been following the process, who have spoken out and helped identify folks who plotted and participated. And I will say that today, I haven't been to the Capitol yet this morning, but when I go later today, I understand that the tall fences and razor wire have been removed and replaced with lower barricades. More entrances have opened. And I know while many are embracing that, some of our frontline officers are having flashbacks of those very lower barricades being used as weapons against them. And so, we're proceeding. It should be the People's House, but it was something that's left a lasting impact that shouldn't be lightly forgotten or brushed off.
Thank you for sharing that. So there's several questions in here about how we restore kind of this political respect and dialogue in this country. I'm sure you've thought about this a lot as a leader in our Senate and in our nation. And it was interesting, this weekend I was watching the new Disney movie Raha and the Last Dragon. And in there's this idea of Kumandra, which is basically these several different nations were all at war and they wanted to be able to work together and at least be able to coexist and work through their differences. So Disney, of course, is just connected to the political and the tenor of the nation in that movie, and it's a good story, and I'd encourage anybody to watch it. But I think that's very similar to our nation right now, which is we've got at least two factions, if not more, that are just unwilling to work together and to get to a productive dialogue around anything, it seems. I know that's not the case. I think there are key issues that really drive the wedges. But as you look forward, how do we overcome that? And there was a question that specifically asked, what are one or two issues that Wisconsinites could get together around that we could really push forward and work together on and get past some of this divisiveness?
This is a great question. So I want to just make a couple of observations underlying our impressions of the state of affairs, as well as, sort of maybe brainstorm with you on paths forward to increase civility, our ability to listen to one another, to hear opposing views, and absorb those constructively in moving forward. But I know that people are incredulous when I say this. However, behind the scenes, there's more bipartisan work occurring than you would know by watching television. All right. I listed a couple in my introductory remarks, including my work with Senator John Thune on making the Paycheck Protection Program work for farmers. We both represent, rural and agricultural states, and recognize the same impediments, and said we want to team up and solve that. And our doing so resulted in changes. And we talk behind the scenes to make those things happen. We try to herald those bipartisan victories when they happen, but we're much more likely to see in the media that various people access the more combative and sometimes you know, sometimes rhetoric that we wish wasn't used, that don't make it easier for folks to come together. I don't think it's fair for politicians to blame the media. Many politicians get on those mediums and hoping to be rebooked will heighten their rhetoric rather than bring it down. So I do think it's incumbent upon people in public life and public service to model the type of language we would want used, even if we risk not being rebooked on a national cable show, et cetera, because we need to set a tone of leadership. And I actually think our new president is very much doing that. And I think that his leadership will, in many ways, help us advance along this path. The other thing I would note about perhaps the role social media has played in all of this, but there are sometimes you have conversations with your neighbors and coworkers, et cetera, and when you get maybe wade into a little bit of politics, you understand, wow, it's like we live in two different worlds. We're not even accepting the same basis of facts. I told you what I feel about the outcome of the last elections. There could be maybe a listener or two or participant in this webinar who says, she's flat out wrong. I read this, I read that. I don't know if that's the case or not, but what I want to say is that, we do have to move towards a common understanding of the truth, naming problems and challenges, recognizing them, which therefore makes it easier to work towards solutions. So, practical suggestions are things like, modeling the behavior you would like to see more frequently, exercising our skills of listening, and perhaps in various legislative bodies, whether it be the state legislature or the Congress of the United States, maybe having the leadership even agree on a handful of issues that from the get-go, we're going to try to really identify a challenge, work through it, and sort of put some limits on getting them, on allowing them to be made the be-all and end-all of one party or the other. Not every issue defines what one party stands for versus what the other party stands for. Sometimes it's just basic problem solving. And I would say among the things that I think we have an option of is one that I really lightly touched on, but a bill that might advance between the American Rescue Plan that's already passed and the Build Back Better Act, which is something that deals with our role in R&D and supply chain vulnerabilities. It's something that we hope will really inure to the benefit of both Wisconsin manufacturing and U.S. manufacturing. If we identify critical things to our national health, safety, and security that we no longer make here or make enough of here, that we can ramp up. And that's something that I hope might be a bipartisan discussion.
All good suggestions. So the next topic I just want to touch on real quickly is around energy and climate and all the things that are being done there. But down in Texas, there was a recent storm that knocked out their energy grid, and that was not only felt in Texas, where an emergency was declared by the president, but it was impacted gas prices and homes across the nation. How do we create a resilient energy infrastructure in this nation? Texas is starting to shift towards renewables and solar and wind, but in certain situations, that grid gets knocked out. And so we have to have redundancies. How do we create a stable energy grid of the future and make sure that it's reliable for everybody?
So I want to say that as we look at infrastructure, I think I said I think of it really broadly: surface transportation, water infrastructure, broadband. But I forgot to say energy infrastructure, and I do believe that that is a key component. And I do want to underscore the questioner's interest in resilience. Because one of the things that I've seen as we see increases in extreme weather events that are happening with greater frequency, that if we simply build back to previous standards and we don't update our building standards to take into account new and emerging data on weather fluctuations, we're going to be building it back and building it back and building it back. And so I think having a focus on resilience and being able to meet new circumstances is going to be a key issue. I think that will take some re-examining of both our transmission grid as well as our distribution grid, and I would say that just like fossil fuels don't all come from the same location and aren't available uniquely across the country, so too our renewables aren't necessarily equally available. So when we look at transmission or distribution upgrades, recognizing those facts are important. I think one of the challenges to making that sort of longer term transition from fossil fuels to renewables, and obviously focusing on climate change in the greater scheme of things, has been our failure to do so in a way that doesn't displace large regional segments of our workforce and leave them without other alternatives. It's just the other day somebody was talking about one of the South Central Wisconsin coal-fired plants that's going to go offline at some point, and all the workers who have worked there for generations and generations, who are highly skilled. If we don't look at opportunities to engage that workforce, there's going to be continued resistance to a transition. And so I know that in Marathon County, maybe I even have a question coming up on this, but worker shortages were something that was a big deal before the pandemic. And now that employment is beginning to scale up again, it's an issue now. And it's true in the Fox Valley of Wisconsin. It's an issue in the far northwest of Wisconsin. It's an issue in many regions of the state. If we can do better regional planning to make sure that, when we're going to see a displacement or a dislocation of a significant number of workers, that we are there ready to help retool their skills and make sure that there's family supporting jobs at the other end of a transition. I think all of these debates will be much more successful.
You are very intuitive. Talent is the number one issue for us in this region, for sure. Actually, just this morning, I heard that it was starting to even reach the depths of firefighters and paramedics and police officers. Traditionally, recruitments that have hundreds of applicants are now struggling to even find a couple. But we all feel it in our businesses, healthcare especially, through the pandemic. Our own experience has been a challenge. So what do you think Wisconsin as a state, I know you work at the federal level, but Wisconsin as a state, what can we do to attract and retain our talent in this state? Because right now it feels like we're fighting a major uphill battle.
So interestingly, the first thing I might say is universal broadband deployment, high-speed broadband. You might be asking yourselves, what does that have to do with what we're asking Senator Baldwin? Okay, I don't need to talk about myself in the third person here. But I think that the lack of access to high-speed broadband has played a role in population loss, and especially youth population loss in our more rural areas where there isn't that access. That young people see economic opportunity only in places where they can access high-speed internet, and therefore the future workforce of families who would much prefer to maintain their roots in rural Wisconsin, enjoy all of the attributes that living in more rural areas hold with it, are leaving. And they would have different choices if we prioritized to even greater degree universal access across our state to high-speed broadband. You can run your small business from, well, one of my favorite examples on a tour a few years back was a small business that had relocated from Chicago to northwestern Wisconsin. They could only do so because the rural development funds were used for a Main Street high-speed infrastructure link, so that they could then market their product to the world rather than just the city of Chicago. And they were doing great. They had moved back to be where, this is a young couple who started the business, near where she had grown up. They were starting their family, and they lived 3 miles away from their Main Street business that employed, I think, 8 at the time. And she couldn't do any, when her second baby was born, she couldn't do any work from home. And that's where she needed to be, and how she wanted to be able to plug into the business. Think of how many more people we would have. So that's one thing. Then I think that over a long period of time, we have devalued the dignity of hard work and manufacturing enterprises. We have pushed all of our young people for pursuing 4-year educations. And while I'm certainly a beneficiary of that, I know that was the thinking in my family. There's no way you're going to take a different path. I think that we can provide much greater opportunities by first of all, allowing young people to think about, do I want to jump into that right away, incur a lot of student debt, or maybe do I want to go to a community college, stay in my community, do a vocational technical college, work for a few years, make sure that all of those credits are transferable if I choose to pursue a 4-year or higher degree later. But that if we did a better job of talking about the opportunities, and not only that, but just sort of incentivizing folks to pursue careers in the places that they would prefer to live in their hometowns, that would be a very important thing. And I think there's a number of initiatives along that line that have shown a lot of prospect. I will say in the area of education, higher education reform, I do believe that we should follow what several of our technical colleges and community colleges have done on a voluntary basis, which is try to make a 2-year tuition commitment for eligible people in the area, so that they don't have to incur significant debt, or maybe any at all, by getting their first 2 years, knowing that, again, if they want to move on, that they can do so with all of their credits being transferable. But if they want to stop then and pursue a career in their home communities, they can do so and be getting pretty far ahead at a very young age.
the sounds of expanded and universal broadband and expanded workforce development and training are all great things. They sound right at home here in Marathon County. So I've got two quick questions for you, and then I'll just leave the last remaining minutes. And thank you. You've been very generous with your time with us today. But I've got two quick questions, and then just if there's anything else you wanted to touch on as we wrap up. So the first question is around committees. So you highlighted the committees that you're on. So what's the one committee that doesn't get enough attention that you're either really excited about or that people should really be paying more attention about that's not often in the national media that you're excited about?
The one committee that I sit on?
Yeah.
Oh my. Gosh, that's a great question. I would say probably, and I don't think I'm answering this as directly as I would typically, but I also serve on a lot of congressional task forces and caucuses that do a lot of really great bipartisan work. So I'm just going to mention one that dovetails directly on what I was just talking about, which is the Senate Career and Technical Education Caucus. It is strictly bipartisan. You can't join it unless you bring a member of the other party with you. I'm one of the 4 co-chairs of the caucus, and it really allows us to work work across committees because those jurisdictions really are in multiple different standing committees of the Senate, hold briefings on meant to highlight successful initiatives in various parts of the country, look at new approaches, innovate, and so I'll choose that as my answer. Just not only the Career and Technical Education Caucus, but the work that I get to do on many other bipartisan entities to focus in much more deeply than we might get a chance to on some of the larger committees that are dealing with hundreds and hundreds of different issues and departments, hundreds of issues, dozens of departments in each committee.
I learned something new today. Thanks for that. And then just recently, you were part of a group that sent a letter to Dominic Mancini, the Deputy Administrator at the Office of Management and Budget, on the designation of metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas. For those that don't know, the metropolitan designation is for communities that are 50,000 or more currently, and the proposal is to shift that to 100,000 or more, which has a large impact here on Marathon County with our metropolitan area, if you will, as we're just underneath that. Can you just mention real briefly where you see that going and whether or not that's actually going to get a change in place, and just where you're at with that policy issue?
Yeah, when I heard the announcement, I felt like, wow, this could have major public policy implications. And I'm not sure that either the Congress itself or stakeholders in affected communities across Wisconsin have had a chance to adequately understand or give input into this change that is being advanced. What it would create is, if you're not a community with over 100,000, as you mentioned, they call metropolitan statistical areas, it would create micropolitan statistical areas. That's a new one for me. But basically, if I would summarize the letter in layman's terms, it's like, whoa, wait a second. Slow down. We want to gain a much fuller understanding of the implications. We want to make sure that our affected constituencies get a chance to be briefed on this, and also a forum with which to express any concerns. And if it reveals significant concerns, that we have some input in, moderating this in a way that it'll work for everyone. So that was a real layperson's. I'm sure that we have it published on my on my website, baldwin.senate.gov. So people can look at the non-lay version of it there.
Well, we hope that that doesn't come to pass and certainly doesn't have the impact on our community. So as we wrap up today, is there anything else you wanted to share with our audience?
Well, I want to reiterate something I said earlier, which is especially as we're dealing with the potential major pieces of economic recovery and infrastructure legislation, as well as overseeing the implementation of the American Rescue Act. We really want real-time comments from all of you who are participating today. Certainly, it doesn't only have to be challenges or difficulties. If somebody has had a big success and says, you know, this worked really well, I want to hear from you also. Sometimes that narrative really is very persuasive with my colleagues. And since this is probably the only county or area in the whole country that cares about this one issue, ginseng. you produce 90% of the country's crop of ginseng. I do want to say that if I don't get input from, I mean, I've enjoyed the input I have gotten already from those who produce ginseng. The one-size-fits-all agriculture programs certainly have not fit the specialty crop that Wisconsin is very proud of. And thank you. That's just a good example and instance of where local stakeholders have worked with my office to make sure we try to adapt programs to be able to meet as many needs as possible.
Great. It's always good to see you, Senator Baldwin. Thank you so much thank you so much for your time today. I want to thank all of our participants for joining our call today, and hope you have a great rest of your day, and everybody stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.